Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. On this week's show, I talked to Aisha Turner, who was a co-producer on Precious Lives, a 2-year radio series about young people and gun violence in Milwaukee. I talked to Turner about the challenges of reporting on the difficult subject and how it impacted her own life.
It made me a lot more present in work, but then I think just in personal relationships more generally. Like, I think I saw like those moments of connection that come when people like really open up about what they're experiencing. And like all of a sudden, they're telling you their story and like they're telling you these things where you just feel like, I haven't even like earned the right to hear this. And it's so moving and I feel so grateful for it. And it made me just feel like that's all that matters is those moments of connection. And I think it has made me someone that has started to prioritize that and think more critically about how I get that in my life, either professionally or personally.
Turner is originally from the Baltimore area and cut her teeth in broadcasting while based in Washington, D.C. as a reporter and producer at the PBS NewsHour. She covered a range of national and international affairs stories and has a special interest in social justice issues. She has worked and studied in various countries throughout Europe and Africa, and has a joint MA in Global Studies from the Universities of Leipzig and Vienna, and a BA in Public Policy and Sociology from Duke University. You're from the Baltimore area. How did you find yourself in Milwaukee working on this Precious Lives project?
So long before I moved to Milwaukee, I lived in Washington, D.C. That would sort of be the first stopover. After college, I moved to Washington and was working for PBS for several years, doing traditional news reporting. And so during that time was just kind of in like a media world a little bit. And then, I left DC when I was 25 and restless and moved abroad for a little bit and then started to really miss journalism and wanted to do more like social justice oriented work and more just issues oriented journalism. And just happened to get an email from someone that I knew from Washington who had worked in radio that met the director and creator of Precious Lives at a conference, and he was looking for a second producer. And so the timing just kind of aligned because I was finishing up grad school when I heard about the project and, applied, made my case for why they should hire someone that had never done radio before and had never been to Milwaukee before. And just it worked out. And I moved in early 2016, about halfway through the project.
For people who maybe live outside of the Milwaukee area who might not have caught the coverage, how would you describe what the project is or was?
Yeah, so the kind of quickest summation is that it's a 100-episode series about gun violence and young people in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so the idea is that every week we produced like a character-driven story about someone that was somehow impacted by the issue of gun violence. In a lot of cases, that meant profiling family members who had lost someone, or just maybe young people that had been involved in some sort of gun crime themselves. We talked to a lot of activists, a lot of teachers, just people that were sort of, again, in any way related to this issue to try to get like a 360 view of the project. And I guess it's important to note that for the creator of the project, it really came out of being really moved by Sandy Hook. And the line that he uses a lot is that the idea was that, there's a mass shooting happening in slow motion every day in the city of Milwaukee, and really in a lot of urban cities in the U.S. And so he wanted a way to profile what was going on and keep it on people's radar so that it wasn't just something that dropped off at the end of, the evening news, that people could kind of like get a window into a world that maybe that they weren't as exposed to. People that were touched by the issue could see themselves reflected more fully and more thoroughly than you often tend to get in news coverage. And so the idea was that to kind of get like a lot of people in the city on board in thinking about this issue and talking about it and working for solutions.
Had you ever been face to face with a similar type of violence in your life, or maybe in your reporting life?
I mean, really, in terms of my reporting life, I had mostly been doing day of national news coverage. So I started my career at the PBS NewsHour and had worked at outlets like that, like there, and like Al Jazeera. And so gun violence was something that we talked about when there was a national news story. So something like I remember covering Sandy Hook, for example. But it was really distant. I think the thing that was different for me about Precious Lives was that it wasn't something that I was doing from a studio in Washington, D.C. I was doing it from actual neighborhoods. And so really for me, that was the first time being so close up to this issue. So that was definitely part of the challenge of joining the project.
When you signed on, did you have any just goals personally that you wanted to accomplish with working on a project like this?
I mean, I wanted to know how to talk about social issues in a way that didn't feel so like distant and political, that could feel like more emotionally driven and more driven by like the people at the center of issues. I'd studied like public policy in college, and so was really used to talking about things from like a very kind of like political sort of policy level analysis. And I think I had kind of gotten to the point where I was much more interested in like figuring out how do I tell stories that would resonate not just intellectually with people, but would really resonate emotionally, and kind of bring like a sense of intimacy. And so that was something that I was really interested in when I joined the project. And then also trying to, think about not just gun violence, but like how do you make sense of gun violence in a larger context, and how do you use one sort of, really like gripping issue to get at things like education and segregation and poverty and all of these different things that lead to all different kinds of inequality that happen in the United States. And so I don't know if that's quite answering your question. I was just basically like interested in how do you cover social justice in a very concrete and like personal way.
When you think back on your time helping to tell these stories, are there any ones in particular that really kind of like dug into your heart or your mind?
I would say two. The first one is, so I said there were 100 episodes. There were actually 101. The second to last episode 100, I think was called Breaking the Cycle of Violence. It was with a man named Garland Hampton. And so we got to the end of the series and realized that we really didn't have that much from people who had been perpetrators of gun violence. And so for episode 100, I interviewed a man who was serving a life sentence out actually near in a facility near Madison right now. He was 15 years old when he shot and killed a fellow gang member. And I think he's very much still in me. His background was really moving. One of the things we talked a lot about through the course of the series, kind of not so much in pieces, but behind the scenes, we talked a lot about trauma and how trauma plays out in communities and in these situations of violence. When you go to violence summits, one of the common phrases is hurt people hurt people. And we thought a lot about how to kind of get at that. And I think Garland he really showed the damage that exists, like at a community level that's leading to a lot of this violence, but like really how it plays out on a personal level. He had dealt with a lot of abuse at home. He had seen a lot of violence. There are actually several members of his family that served time for murders. And so in a weird and really awful way, the fact that he would be serving this life sentence for murder felt like just part of a sort of family trajectory, and kind of felt like this legacy of violence that he was given before he was even an adult. And I think doing that story, I think that's probably the story I think most about now, several years out, because I think it was one of those ones where you like leave the interview and your heart just breaks because, he's committed this awful crime, right? And he is serving a life sentence. But you also see that he was someone that has experienced a lot of hurt and did not know how to deal with that and wasn't given the tools to. And the system very much failed him. He talks about like some of his siblings going into foster care and he never did. And so was never taken out of a dangerous situation at home. Talks about growing up, like going to school, kind of dirty. And it was really obvious that something was maybe wrong with him, but teachers never really said anything. So you wonder like, why weren't there adults intervening sooner? And so for me, that was like one of those ones where it felt really frustrating because you also saw him as someone that was like trying to turn his life around and, might never actually get a chance to do much with that development, other than kind of, jobs here and there and have like the sort of personal satisfaction that comes from doing that in prison. But he seemed like someone that could very much be a productive member of society and might never actually get to enter it. So the other one, I worked with I profiled a group called Programming the Parks. There are these activists in the Sherman Park neighborhood on the north side who basically just heard about kids getting into fights and just started showing up over the summer to have like cookouts and to do events and to get the kids volunteering and just would like intervene when things would start to go wrong. And they saw that both as a way of keeping kids out of like the violence that was happening amongst themselves and amongst their groups. But then also they saw that as a way of keeping them out of the hands of law enforcement, because for them, they felt that, when the police get involved, that's when things escalate. And so they sort of saw themselves as like a protective force and a calming force in the neighborhood. And then in the midst of reporting that story, there were like 3 days in a row, there were instances of violence like right in the few blocks surrounding it. So I just sort of saw just how much these kids are dealing with and what they're living in. One day there was a sort of shootout after a big fight, and I, went to just sort of check in and see how things were developing. And then while I was there was a shooting at the intersection outside of the Boys and Girls Club. And these kids then see someone that like dying in the street, and for them saw the police and like officials not act as quickly as they would have expected to or would have wanted them to. And then over a few days later, there was a police shooting a couple blocks away, and someone, I think he was 23 years old, Seville Smith, he was shot and killed by a police officer right down the street from this park where I'd been reporting. And then the neighborhood just descends into unrest for 2 nights in a row, where buildings are on fire and, the police are being called in riot gear. And I think you saw these people trying to kind of hold things together almost with their bare hands, because they don't get a lot of resources from the city or from the state because they're not an official organization. But at the same time, because they've been through a lot of the stuff that these kids are going through, they have a little bit more credibility than a lot of outside organizations do. But you also see just how quickly things can erupt. And watching these buildings on fire and seeing how angry people were after this police shooting, while at the same time knowing all of the violence that was already in this community, I saw it all kind of pile on top of each other. And I think those few days of like reporting out that story and seeing it shift and seeing it like kind of escalate on top of each other, it felt um, really both really exhausting and disappointing because it felt like then the city started to pay attention and there was a lot of this rhetoric around like violence doesn't solve anything. I don't know why these kids are acting out, but like for me, I saw that like it did get people involved, and that was when a lot of the attention came, and a lot of resources started to pour into that community only after things got really bad. And so that's kind of what I think about a lot now too, is just like, one, how do you support local activism sooner? And, how do you just do it in a way that's like so much more connected to what people actually need versus kind of waiting for things to feel like they're in a crisis moment.
Did you, when you're kind of going through those couple of few days where all these things are kind of like boiling over and kind of happening, and just in general during your reporting, did you at all feel like you were ever in an unsafe situation?
I think for the most part, I felt fine and safe. And I think, honestly, I think this project challenged a lot of what I think of as like safe neighborhoods and all of that. I think it, forced me to confront a lot of my own biases about like where it's okay to be and things like that. I also think that, but I think the second scenario I was talking about where there was a lot of unrest after the police shootings, I think that was probably the time when I felt most unsafe in doing this work. Because for the most part, we were out like during the day and we were with people that we knew. And so it was fine. And then also like you get to the point where like you're familiar with the neighborhoods. And so like you kind of have your own sense of like where you feel okay and where you don't. But then I think doing the reporting around like the days of unrest, there was just so much anger at that point. I remember like the second night being out and like kind of like losing track of the people that I'd kind of been with, like the people that I felt were kind of like looking out for me a little bit. There was also a lot of anger at that point, not just at police, but also at media. And so I think for me, it was a little bit easier for me to be out because one, when you're a radio reporter, your equipment isn't quite as obvious as if you're a TV crew. But then I also think being a Black reporter, it wasn't like so obvious that I was part of the media as it was for a lot of like my white colleagues. And then we actually like wound up having a conversation about it as a staff because I remember like, I think my boss was very much of the mindset like where you go and you stay in the story and you're there as long as you need to be. But I just at one point just felt like no longer safe being there, especially when there are like people start making explicit threats against media. And so we kind of sort of wound up afterwards having to kind of rethink like what does it mean to kind of go out and report on these stories, and at what point do you break off and kind of figure we'll get what we need later, especially because we weren't breaking news, so our needs were a little bit different. But I think that after that event, we started to become a lot more thoughtful about how we go out and report.
You talked to a lot of people who had some just terrible things happen to them in their lives. How do you approach people and talk to people and kind of get them to open up and kind of tell their story and talk about their pain?
God, I think one big thing is that you don't only talk to them about their pain. I think you spend a lot of time with people. It's not just in and out. But I think sort of like the initial contact, I think this project kind of broke a lot of what I think of as like sort of traditional reporting tactics, and that like I think for a lot of radio folks there's this rule that you always have your equipment and you approach people with the microphone and et cetera, et cetera. And I think I almost never approach people at first with a microphone. It was always very much like, this is who I am and this is like what I work on, but like with the equipment not even off, but just away. unless it was like a sort of obvious new situation. But for the most part, I was just sort of showing up and introducing myself to people. I would always try to go face to face, maybe make initial contact over the phone, but then like I really think it was important to explain the project and explain the work and explain who I am in person. And also like I would give people a lot of time to decide if they wanted to be a part of it, and a lot of spaces to kind of like back out. And a lot of my questions are often kind of couched in like, we don't have to go here if you don't want to, but, and then kind of asking the question. And then also, like, if you're talking to someone about something painful that they've gone through, recognizing that that's not their whole life. I remember there was a shootout in a neighborhood, and this a 9-year-old girl, Zalea Jenkins, was shot and killed. And I remember there was a march, and then there was sort of like a media swarm after the march that her family put on. And like a lot of the questions from reporters were around like, to her mom, or, about like living in like a quote unquote bad neighborhood, or just felt like sort of like a kind of accusatory and like blaming the mom a little bit for the neighborhood that they lived in, when in reality, like, it's not, these things aren't something that happen every day. I think recognizing that like all parents are looking out for their kids, and like treating parents that have like been through this with like that level of like the level of dignity that you would treat any other parent who's lost someone. I think, not going to the difficult questions right away. Like when we reported on Zalea, a lot of the questions were about like, very few of the questions were about the night of the shooting. A lot of them were about like who Zalea was, and the fact that she was a tomboy and liked to rap and like play her cousins in football, and that she was like sassy and helped take care of her siblings. And so I think that idea of kind of giving family members the space to not just talk about the difficult times, but like the joy and the love that they had for someone is an important part of the process. The same thing with Garland Hampton, the man who had shot and killed someone when he was 15. The conversation wasn't just about that event, and really very little of it was about that. It was a lot about the difficult stuff that he went through in his childhood, but also like his favorite memories of buying like a Transformer set with his grandfather, and like now the work that he's doing to like, train himself in these like different skills and in his favorite things that he likes to do. And so I think the shorter answer to your question really just kind of comes down to like providing space for people to like have a full experience that's not just about their pain, but that like considers their pain in like a larger context of good and bad and dark and light and all of that complexity.
There was one episode of the project where you were talking with your like other team members on the project about what it was like to do the work, and you brought up the idea of emotional vulnerability. And I think both in terms of your sources, but also I think you were talking a little bit about your own emotional vulnerability. Do you feel like you had to have emotional vulnerability within yourself to be able to help tell these stories, to be able to connect with the people?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to ask someone else to open up if you aren't open to. And that doesn't necessarily mean putting my emotional stuff onto the people that I'm reporting on. But I think it means like creating space in my own. I think for all of us, it meant creating space in our own lives to feel and to react in whatever way felt natural in the moment. And, you're still a reporter, you still have some distance, but like often, I would go back to the office and talk to Emily or Ashley, the other reporters doing this work, and just sort of say like how the interview impacted me and, what I was feeling afterwards, and taking space to kind of rest afterwards, because it is a lot to take in. And I think it's hard to tell the stories with the sensitivity that's needed if you're not able to feel any of it, if you're sort of only working from a sort of traditional emotionless distance that is often asked of reporters, that I think is kind of flawed in general. And, I think it meant also like having like we had a lot of really difficult conversations behind the scenes about race, and how like I was the only Black reporter. Our host was Black, but in terms of like the people like doing the field work, I was the only Black reporter on the team. And so telling these stories mostly about Black people impacted me in a way that was really different than the other reporters. But at the same time, because they were white and going into these Black neighborhoods, like they were dealing with like their own difficult thoughts around race and where you belong, where you fit in community, things like that. And so I think that, I don't know that maybe this still could have been done well without that kind of emotional vulnerability. But I think, to me, the power of these stories is that they create intimacy. And like that's, to me, is also just the power that radio can have in general. And so I don't think that you can do that well if you're emotionally removed. But I'm also an emotional person, so who knows? Like maybe that's just how I most naturally operate in the world. And so that's kind of what was just needed in order for me to feel grounded and sane in doing this project.
You jumped forward on a question that I was going to ask a little bit later, but since you brought it up, you mentioned that you're Black and some of the other team members on the project were white, and you had conversations behind the scenes about race. I'm wondering if you learned anything talking to each other behind the scenes. Were there any good discussions or any things that clarified things for each team member?
I feel like my only answer to that is like corny. Just like, I mean, I don't know. It's essentially that like everyone's dealing with their own pain, and their own like difficulties in the world. Because it was really, there would be moments when I would just sort of like find it like difficult to like have any kind of conversation with like the other team member, because I was just like, you just don't get it. It's different when you're Black and doing this work. And I think in some ways it is different. But also like I think in talking to them and seeing like what they were struggling with, I don't know, you just see the person that's in front of you, and it becomes a little bit less about like race in these larger ways, and it just becomes about like how these larger things are playing out for each of you individually, and like how the person in front of you is struggling and figuring out how to support each other through that. And so I just became a lot less of a believer in broad like solutions or broad thinking, and I believed so much more in just the particularities of what anyone's going through, both in terms of like talking to the other reporters, but also just more in general with this project. That's not a very clear answer, but I don't know. I think I just figured out how to be more honest and like see the person in front of me.
I think it is impossible to talk about the gun violence issue in Milwaukee without talking about race, as I think you've said. And I'm just kind of curious where you saw that come out in your coverage. Where did you see race intersecting with the issue that you were covering in Precious Lives?
I don't think it's something that became explicit in the coverage that often. It was something that we talked a lot about as a team in terms of like, do we need to get other angles? Like, are we like, how do we best like acknowledge the fact that this is a problem without also contributing to stereotypes of like Black neighborhoods? I think it came out a lot in reporting and trying to pitch the project to people. As like, when you say like, I I'm a journalist, I'm covering gun violence, people kind of get exhausted by it and feel like it's it's sort of obvious and just like not interesting anymore. And especially if you're working for a predominantly white organization, I think there's like a lot of just skepticism from people about how much they want to open up, or if you're even talking about the right thing. Because really in talking about gun violence, you're talking about these other systemic inequalities. And so gun violence kind of felt like sensational for a lot of people. There was one family, one of the first families I interviewed, the Marshalls, who they're white. They had moved from the suburbs into the inner city and got a lot of pushback from family and friends, like to the point where like they had to change realtors because the realtors like wouldn't show them houses in the Black neighborhoods, because they shouldn't live with like those people. That's what they were told. And, so they talked a lot about like kind of grappling with race as like one of the white families on the block, and sort of having to confront the idea that like it is all about the difficult stuff. And, talked a lot about like Easter egg hunts that they would have every spring and these community dinners that they had every week. They were sort of the family that I think for a lot of that would have most closely resembled a lot of our public media audience. And I think for me, it was really important to have a family that could kind of bridge that divide a little bit. And sort of, I mean, I don't know, I'm hesitant to say this because I don't think this should have to exist. But I think that sometimes people kind of need to hear from people that they kind of more closely align with, in order to like understand a situation that feels really far removed from them. And so for me, they were a family that could do that for a lot of our audience.
I think that goes to the question of like audience, like who were you trying to reach with these stories?
Yeah. This is something that I was constantly tortured about, actually, because we aired on the on WUWM, which is Milwaukee Public Radio. It's the NPR affiliate in the city. Then we also aired on WNOV, which is a Black Talk radio station. And then within we had the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel coverage. And so when I joined the project, it was kind of pitched to me as like the idea is to get people that wouldn't ordinarily know about or care about gun violence to engage in this issue, which I heard in what I think was meant by that was that it was getting essentially the sort of wealthier, whiter parts of Milwaukee to care about what was happening in poor communities of color. And I think that was how we framed a lot of the series, was sort of this idea of like bringing people into this community that they don't know a lot about. I think partway through, I started to feel a little bit exasperated by that idea, and saw a lot of the flaws in that, because I felt I just sort of got exhausted by this idea of using the pain that Black people are going through in order to speak to white people and change white people's consciousness. And I started to think more about like, how do we talk? Like, what would our WNOV audience want to hear? Like, if you are in this community, like, what would resonate and feel like how would you want to hear gun violence covered? Like, how would I, as a Black person, want to hear gun violence covered? And I started to care a little bit less about audience and a little bit more. This isn't making sense. Basically, this is the thing I struggled with. Okay. I just tried to think a little bit less about like media as bridge building and more about like media as a sort of shared space of like feeling reflected and feeling kind of like seen and heard. And then if in that process there is like bridge building and like crossing divides that happens, that's great. But I think when we were kind of centering the bridge building aspect of the work, I think that made it kind of easy to fall into tropes, to fall into like framing things to be about like pity and not about like complexity and resilience.
Among the people that you talked to who were victims of gun violence, whose family members or friends were victims of gun violence, was there a consistency at all to what they wanted, I guess, out of the coverage that you were, in their interviews, or like, did they want justice? Did they want closure? What do you think they were kind of seeking in talking to you?
A lot of it was that they don't want their loved one to be forgotten. I think there's an awareness that, the news cycle moves on. And often the news cycle, I mean, it's a hard business. And so it's easy for a story to be 2 or 3 minutes and then that's kind of it. And so I think that there is a desire to kind of keep their loved ones' names in people's consciousness. And because we were sort of longer form, like you could paint a fuller picture of who this person was more publicly, and what the family was going through. And then, yeah, there is, of course, a lot of people would want answers as to like, why did this happen? But I don't think that those answers were satisfying. Like our very last episode, the very first episode of the series that my co-producer Emily did was about a girl named Layla Peterson, who was 5 years old when she was shot and killed inside her grandparents' home. And so for the very last episode, Emily talked to the family again, and then I talked to the detectives that solved the case. And a lot of what the family wanted was, like answers of like why this happened and who did this and why would you do this? But then the story is about them getting answers and hearing from these detectives that like solved this case and how they did it. And like what you ultimately learn is that it was random, and it was the people that shot the house got the wrong house. And so you have answers, but they're not satisfying. So I think kind of on a larger scale, no, I don't know that anyone said this. I can't remember anyone saying this, but my sense was like on a larger scale, people just like wanted this to stop in the city because there is a awareness that it happens too much. It's happening over and over and over again after there are all of these calls for nonviolence and for things to stop and for solutions, and then it keeps going. And I think obviously that's heartbreaking, but it's also exhausting. If you've lost someone and you're not seeing this pattern stop, you want, I don't know, you just want it to stop. That's not very insightful, but it felt like an overall exasperation with the city, not just in their own particular cases.
At the start of each episode, there's the voices of children that kind of introduce the project. I don't know if you recorded any of those voices, but I'm sure you've listened to them a lot. It's because it's the open of the project, and I'm sure you heard it many, many times. What do you hear and think about when you hear that open?
I mean, I think there's sort of the obvious innocence, right? But then there's also, to me, I think about how this is so a part of people's lives so early on. And I think that there's a lot of focus. I mean, obviously our series was about young people, but just in general, I think with a lot of violence prevention stuff, there's a lot of focus on youth and like, how do we keep young people away from violence? How do we, protect them from this? And I think more about like the fact that these kids are really young and growing up in this environment, and it becomes, I don't know if normal is the right word, but they're surrounded by it and then become adults, and what happens to them when they're adults, and we no longer have that same space for sympathizing with them or seeing their innocence, and like what happens when we lose sight of the fact that all of these adults that are committing crimes and that we're locking up were these kids at one point that like really didn't have that much of a choice in where they were and what they were doing and the neighborhood that they grew up in, and what they were exposed to. So I think that sort of cycle to me is kind of what I find heartbreaking, is that like we can have this we can acknowledge the innocence and feel this like protectiveness over the kids that we hear, but we lose sight of that as people grow up. I will also say regarding that intro, I've also heard critiques of it. Just the fact that we would like have kids talking about guns in the intro. We did get some, I mean, I don't know how widely the critiques went, but I definitely heard from several people that like really hated that intro.
I want to ask a little bit about the medium that you were working in, which is radio or audio.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like that was especially impactful for this particular project?
I guess I have to say I do. So Precious Lives for me was my first time doing radio. I'd always worked in TV before, or print. And to me, I saw that, and I mean, and obviously we had a print component, but I think there's something about hearing someone's voice that feels a little bit more intimate and a little bit more raw than you're going to be able to capture just in writing, and a little bit more unfiltered than you'd be able to get like on TV. I think that, you know, in TV there's a kind of a premium placed on, you know, can this person speak like kind of like sharply and to the point and like make their like sort of deliver their point in a soundbite and, you know, present in a certain way. And I think in radio or in audio, there's much more openness to just the variation in the voice that can exist and wanting to capture the emotion that can exist in someone's voice and the like regionalisms that come out as people talk and their turns of phrase. Like that becomes really exciting in audio. And I think that gives you a much better sense of someone's like personality and what they're feeling as they're talking than can exist in a lot of other mediums. Not to say that those can't do it, but I just think it's especially powerful in radio. And so I think when you're doing something that is so sensitive and like really emotionally loaded, but also can be really divisive, when you're doing something across like audiences, like we were talking about before, I think it's important to just be able to like hear someone and feel like emotionally impacted by them. And I think, you know, there were instances where, you know, we're capturing people just in like daily conversation, whether that's like, you know, like the sort of funny parts of someone's life, or, you know, someone in a fight and then there's like, you know, gunshots ring out. That's in one of my pieces. Like, I think we're able to capture the atmosphere a lot more and really bring people into it in a way that I think is pretty unique to audio, not just because of the sort of visceral reaction that you can have by hearing something, but also just because like I think about both like the difference between audio and print, but I also think about the difference between audio and TV. And I felt like for me, TV is so much more like distant because like even as the producer, you're looking through a lens in order to capture something. Whereas with audio, you're like very much like face to face in the moment. There aren't lights around you distracting the person that you're talking to. People definitely get intimidated by the microphone, but after a while they kind of forget about it and you're kind of able to blend into the scene a little bit more than you can with television. And so, yeah, I think there's something kind of special about radio that I got to see through doing that work.
When you were putting together the stories, what kind of sound, like background sound or interviews, what kind of tape were you looking to kind of get to kind of put the elements of the whole thing together? What did you need when you were approaching each individual episode?
I mean, you need a scene, which I did not understand when I first started. In that, like, you just sort of needed people organically interacting with each other, if you could get it, that illustrated some point that you were trying to make. So when I talk about like the kids in the park where the activists were like breaking up fights and things like that, one of the scenes is like an actual sort of an activity that kind of spirals out of control that's there to illustrate like both the efforts of the work that they're doing, but also how it can sometimes fall short. But then you also hear one of the guys like rein everything back in as the police show up. And so the idea is that like you are hopefully just around enough to capture people in their element without you becoming a distraction. And so you're just looking for something that feels like captivating for you and compelling for you that will hopefully translate in terms of audio. And then you're looking for a good storyteller. Some people are just like great to listen to and just fascinating and kind of draw you in, and you want to like keep knowing more about them. And that's not always like the most likable person. Sometimes it is. But the people that like you kind of like leave the conversation and they've made you think differently, or they've like made this point that like you never would have thought of, or had a turn of phrase that just like kind of struck you by surprise. You're looking for that a lot. And then you're looking for like things to change within the context of your story. So you're sort of trying to see like, who was this person that I'm profiling before they did X, Y, or Z, or before X, Y, or Z happened to them, and like, who are they now? And how have they kind of shifted? How can I show that they have shifted or overcome something in the course of a few minutes? So you're looking for those moments too.
Did working on this project change you in any way?
Yeah, a lot. I think, I mean, I was a part of it for what feels like a very brief period of time, but I feel like it was one of my most profound work experiences. I think it made me believe so much more in like the power of local work and the power of community. It made me see what it could look like to be part of a community. And to be part of a community conversation. And I saw people that are living in a really tough city, in a city that like a lot of people leave, that people take pride in leaving. And the people, there are also people that have like stuck it out and have, decided that like this is where they're going to make home and they're going to fight for it, even when it's hard. And I just had such respect for that. And it made me want that so badly in life. And also, this project, I think, made me a lot more present in work, but then I think just in personal relationships more generally. Like, I think I saw like those moments of connection that come when people like really open up about what they're experiencing. And like all of a sudden, they're telling you their story, and like they're telling you these things where you just feel like I haven't even like earned the right to hear this. And it's so moving, and I feel so grateful for it. And it made me just feel like that's all that matters, is those moments of connection. And I think it has made me someone that has started to prioritize that and think more critically about how I get that in my life, either professionally or personally.
Yeah, in that episode that we were talking about earlier, where you're having a conversation with the other producers on the project, you had an interesting moment of kind of clarity. I thought kind of at the end, which when you were trying to figure out how to end the episode, it seemed to like perfectly encapsulate the whole issue, which is you didn't really know how to end it. You didn't really know how to end the conversation or what to say or what to do. Do you feel like if you were to go back and have that conversation again, you would have a better way of encapsulating the conversation or the project in your mind?
Oh, wow. No, I don't. I think that is what Precious Lives taught me. Things are messy and complicated and not at all, very rarely clear. Like everything is just, I honestly, so, it's like, it's very hard for me to talk about Precious Lives in a way that feels like I can like kind of encapsulate it and have like a clear point. And this is like, I'm sure that you're noticing this in this conversation, but really like anytime I talk about this project, it just feels like I'm like word vomiting because it brings up so many feelings and so many complicated moments and just so many like moments of like just like profound like sadness, but also these like really moving moments of connection and like an awareness of like the pain that people are carrying, but also the fact that that is not at all the complete story of anyone's life. And you are both like a journalist in terms of like you're trying to like sum up things neatly, but you know that that's impossible. So you're kind of doing it in this way that like you need to do in order to make your story. But like you want people to know that that's not what it is. And you want people to know that like part of this project is about becoming really comfortable with like complexity and messiness. And so that, yeah, no, I'd probably do the same way, but maybe feel a little more confident in the fact that things are messy. I feel like that has changed. I just accept it now. There's an acceptance of it.
At the beginning of the year, you left Milwaukee. You headed to New York City for a pretty cool gig. For people who miss your voice on the radio in Milwaukee, what have you been up to?
I'm now a producer at StoryCorps. StoryCorps is a national oral history project, and we record interviews for the Library of that are archived at the Library of Congress. But I work on the production team, and so we try to take some of those recordings and see if we can make them work for the radio. And so the idea is that we want people to be recording their voices and the voices of their family members for posterity, but we also want to be able to share some of those now and with a wider audience. And so I work on the team that we often will use stuff from the archive, but like we also just as often pitch our own stories and sort of say like this person in like Dallas has this like incredible life story. So let me go fly there and record them talking to someone that in their life, like a family member or friend that they have a relationship with. And we try to edit that down for radio and try to make these what our director calls like these sort of 2 minutes of poetry out of people's words. And so my voice is nowhere on the radio now. It's very much just like taking what other people have talked about in their interviews and trying to shape it. And kind of the way that it's been described to me is like you pick the listener up at the beginning of the story and you bring them along and then you let them down gently at the end. And so it's this idea that like you're immersed for these like 2 or 3 minutes in someone's world, and you see how they have changed or how one moment has changed them every Friday morning on Morning Edition. So, yeah.
So have you heard any good poems, I guess, in your work so far?
Well, one thing I'm learning about doing this work is that it takes forever to do a single story. I think I've heard a lot that I really like. My favorite one that I've produced so far is about a man who is stationed in the Korangal Valley of Afghanistan as part of the army. And so the Korangal Valley was like one of the most remote and most dangerous parts in the war in Afghanistan. And he talks about being really homesick and like 7,000 miles away from home. And then one day gets a package from his Mima from South Georgia. That's a sour cream pound cake. And just talks about like what that moment meant for him and how it felt like in that moment when he was like feeling so lonely and so kind of cold and depressed. He, got this package and it felt like his Mima was there to comfort him. And so that one stuck with me a lot.
I love that. Is there anything else I should have asked you about the Precious Lives project?
I don't think so. You asked like good questions. I haven't it's been a while since I've thought about Precious Lives, and I appreciate it because I have very complicated feelings about it, but I really, I feel really proud to have been a part of it. So I appreciate this.
That was Aisha Turner speaking from New York City. If you are interested, I highly suggest you check out the archive of Precious Life stories at preciouslivesproject.org. Make sure to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. Also, you can stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers!